the horrifying duty of a 40K Relic Keeper. I have been dead for 17 years, though my heart still beats and my lungs still draw the recycled air of the vault. My death did not come with a blade or a bolt, but with understanding. It was a slow revelation that trickled into my consciousness like poison into a water supply, until the man I'd been dissolved entirely, leaving only this hollow vessel to tend the Emperor's sacred remnants in the darkness beneath the shrine world's surface. They tell me I am blessed, that I have been chosen for this holy work, that my service will be remembered in the great ledgers of the ecclesiarchy when my physical form finally surrenders. I believed them once, in those early days when I still had a name that felt like my own, when I could still remember my mother's face, when the smell of incense was merely oppressive rather than suffocating. The vault stretches for 3 kilometers in every direction from the central sanctum, a labyrinth of stone corridors carved into the bedrock of a world whose only purpose is veneration. The walls weep moisture constantly, condensation from the temperature differential between the deep cold of the earth and the heat of 10,000 prayer candles that burn without cease in the upper levels. That moisture runs down the ancient stonework in rivulets that trace patterns I have long since memorized. Patterns that sometimes seem to form words in a language I almost recognize, almost understand. Before my mind recoils, and I remind myself that such thoughts are dangerous, that doubt is the first step towards damnation. The air tastes of minerals and wax, and the peculiar sweetness of decay that no amount of sacred oils can quite mask. It is the smell that has seeped into my robes, my skin, the very marrow of my bones, until I cannot remember what clean air tastes like. I was 23, standard years old, when I took my oaths in the cathedral above, out there standing before the archdeacon with the assembled faithful, watching from pews of dark wood, polished by centuries of use. My voice was steady when I recited the words, the promise to preserve and protect the holy artifacts entrusted to my care, to keep them safe from the touch of the unworthy, to maintain the sanctity of the vault until death, or until the ecclesiarchy released me from my bonds. The latter was a formality, a phrase included in the ritual that everyone understood held no real possibility. Relic keepers serve until their bodies fail, until their hands can no longer lift the censers or their eyes can no longer read the preservation protocols inscribed in high Gothic on the vault's walls. Even then, even when age or infirmity claims us, we do not truly leave. Our bones are interred in the ossuary chapel, our skulls arranged in neat rows to watch over the relics we tended in life, as if death were merely another stage of service. The first artifact they assigned to my care was a fragment of bone 3 centimeters long, yellowed with age and sealed in a reliquary of silver and glass. The placard beside it, written in an elaborate script by some long-dead scribe, identified it as a metacarpal from the right hand of Saint Millennium the Resolute, who had died holding a breach against the green tide on some distant world during the 3rd century of the 41st millennium. I would spend the next 2 hours every morning cleaning that reliquary, breathing on the glass and polishing it with a cloth of sacred silk, ensuring no fingerprint or speck of dust marred its surface. Then I would recite the saint's litany, 47 verses describing her martyrdom in excruciating detail. Each wound catalogued, each prayer she offered to the emperor as her life bled away, documented with the precision of an administratum ledger. My predecessor, a man named Corvin, whose hands had grown twisted with arthritis until he could no longer perform his duties, had instructed me in these rituals during my month of training. His voice was a rasping whisper in the vault's darkness as he showed me how to measure the sacred oils, how to test the seals for degradation, how to recognize the signs of corruption that might threaten the relics. Corvin's eyes had held a strange quality, I remember now, though at the time I attributed it to age and the decades he had spent in the vault's dim illumination. They seemed to look through me rather than at me, as if his vision had adjusted to seeing something other than the material world, something that existed in the shadows between the flickering candles and the cold stone. He spoke of the relics with a reverence that bordered on fear. His instructions delivered with the urgency of a man trying to pass on vital information before time ran out. When he died 3 weeks after my training ended, collapsing in the corridor outside the sanctum of secondary martyrs, his twisted hands clutching at his chest, they found his lips moving soundlessly, forming words that the attending priest could not decipher. They interred him in the ossuary chapel with full honors. And now his skull watches from the 3rd row, 7th position from the left. His empty sockets turned toward the vault entrance as if waiting for something to emerge from the darkness. The routine consumed me quickly, as routines do in places where time loses meaning and one day blends seamlessly into the next. I would wake in my cell, a narrow space cut into the rock furnished with only a hard cot, a desk, and a small shrine to the Emperor, where I performed my morning devotions, and descend the spiral staircase to the vault proper. The stairs wound down through the bedrock for nearly 100 meters, each step worn smooth by the passage of countless feet over centuries of use. Sometimes I would count them, using the numbers as a meditation, a way to clear my mind and prepare myself for the sacred work ahead. 364 steps, never more, never less. Though there were mornings when I could have sworn the count changed. When I arrived at the vault entrance convinced I had counted wrong, that there had been 365 or 363, though I could never quite trust my own memory in those moments. The vault door was a massive thing of blessed steel inscribed with words and prayers in a dozen languages, some of which predated the Imperium itself, if the ecclesiarchy records were to be believed. It required 2 keys to open, one that I wore on a chain around my neck, hidden beneath my robes against my bare chest, where the cold metal had worn a permanent mark into my skin, and another that was kept in the upper cathedral, held by the archdeacon himself as a safeguard against theft or heresy. Each morning, at exactly 6 bells, the archdeacon's servant would bring the 2nd key down those worn stairs, and together we would unlock the vault, the mechanism grinding and clicking as ancient gears turned within the door's massive frame. The servant, a mute boy whose tongue had been removed as penance for some childhood transgression, would hand me the key without meeting my eyes, then retreat back up the stairs as quickly as his legs could carry him, as if afraid that lingering too long might trap him in the vault's gravity, pull him down into the darkness where men like me spent their lives then tending to the holy dead. Inside, the vault was a cathedral in miniature, its ceiling lost in shadows 3 stories above, its walls lined with alcoves and niches where the relics rested in their various housings. Bone fragments and scraps of cloth, pieces of armor and broken weapons, vials of dried blood and locks of hair. The detritus of martyrdom and sacrifice collected over millennia and brought to this world to be venerated, to be preserved, to serve as physical links between the faithful and the Emperor's divine grace. Each relic had its own story, its own litany, its own specific preservation requirements, detailed in the great tome that rested on a lectern in the central sanctum. That tome, bound in leather that I preferred not to think too carefully about, contained 3,000 pages of single-spaced, high Gothic text, cross-referenced and annotated by generations of Relic Keepers, who had added their own observations and warnings in margins already crowded with cramped handwriting. I learned quickly that not all relics were equal in their demands. Some required only basic maintenance: dusting, prayer, the occasional application of sacred oils to prevent desiccation. Others were more particular, their preservation protocols filled with warnings and specific instructions that had to be followed exactly lest the relic's sanctity be compromised. The finger bone of St. Malchius, for instance, had to be exposed to candlelight for exactly 17 minutes each day, no more and no less. While the litany of his martyrdom was recited in the original Terran Gothic rather than the modern dialect, the scrap of banner from the Battle of Crimson Vale required incense made from a specific blend of herbs, 3 of which were imported from off-world at tremendous expense, burned in a brazier that had itself been blessed by no fewer than 7 cardinal-level priests. The vial containing 3 drops of blood, said to have fallen from the Emperor himself during his battle with the arch-traitor. Though even the archdeacon admitted this claim was historically dubious, sat in an alcove of its own, surrounded by prayer scrolls and purity seals, guarded by a servo skull that had been programmed to sound an alarm if anyone approached without speaking the proper devotions. The work was endless and exacting, each day a mirror of the one before, each hour measured out in prayers and protocols that allowed no room for error or innovation. I would begin at the eastern end of the vault, moving methodically through the alcoves, checking seals and recording any changes in the relic's condition in my daily log. Some days, there would be nothing to report. The relics remained exactly as they had been the day before, and the day before that, unchanging in their sacred stillness. Other days, I would notice small details, minute variations that probably meant nothing, but which I recorded anyway because the protocols demanded it. A slight darkening in the color of a bone fragment, a new crack in the glass of a reliquary, a faint smell that hadn't been there before, sweet and rotten at the same time, emanating from an alcove that held the skull of a minor saint whose name I could never quite remember, despite having recited her litany hundreds of times. The isolation was total in those early months, broken only by the morning delivery of the second vault key and the weekly visit from Father Dominic, the priest assigned to hear my confession and ensure I had not fallen into heresy or despair. Father Dominic was an old man, older than Corvin had been, his face a landscape of wrinkles and liver spots, his hands trembling slightly as he held the holy symbol before my kneeling form. He would ask me the standard questions. Had I maintained the relics properly? Had I performed all the required rituals? Had I experienced any doubts about the Emperor's divinity or the righteousness of the ecclesiarchy? And I would give him the standard answers, reciting them from memory, while my mind wandered to thoughts of the surface world I had left behind. The sky I could no longer see, the sunlight that had become an abstract concept rather than a physical reality. The work is holy, Father Dominic would remind me, his voice cracking with age and the damp air that seemed to bother his lungs more each time he descended into the vault. You are the guardian of the sacred, the keeper of the faithful's connection to the martyred and the blessed. There is no higher calling, no greater honor. I believed him then. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him, because the alternative, that I had chosen to bury myself alive in this stone tomb, that I would spend the rest of my life breathing recycled air and cleaning relics, whose authenticity was sometimes questionable at best, was too terrible to contemplate. So I nodded and accepted his blessing, his hand heavy on my bowed head, and I returned to my work with renewed dedication, telling myself that doubt was weakness, that faith required sacrifice, that the Emperor demanded nothing less than everything from his servants. It was 3 years into my service when I first noticed the dreams. They came not as narratives or visions, but as sensations, feelings that lingered after waking like the aftertaste of spoiled food. I would lie in my narrow cot, staring up at the rough stone ceiling of my cell, trying to remember what had disturbed my sleep, but the details slipped away like water through cupped hands, leaving only a residue of unease and a certainty that something had been trying to communicate with me in that twilight space between consciousness and oblivion. The dreams, if they were dreams, seemed to cluster around certain days, certain times when I had spent longer than usual working with particular relics, though I could never quite pin down the pattern, could never quite articulate what I suspected even to myself in the privacy of my own thoughts. The bone fragments were the worst. There were hundreds of them in the vault, pieces of saints and martyrs and heroes of the Imperium, each one housed in its own reliquary, each one demanding its own rituals of preservation and veneration. When I held them, when I lifted them from their housings to clean the glass or replace the prayer scrolls, I could feel a weight that had nothing to do with physical mass, a presence that pressed against my thoughts like a hand against a window. Some of the fragments felt warm, though the vault's temperature never varied, maintained at exactly 15 degrees Celsius by ancient environmental systems built into the rock itself. Others felt cold beyond cold, a chill that seemed to bypass my flesh entirely and sink into the core of me, into whatever it was that animated this body and gave it the illusion of life. I mentioned none of this to Father Dominic during my weekly confessions. How could I explain something I barely understood myself? Something that existed more as intuition than evidence. How could I tell him that sometimes, when the vault was at its quietest, when the only sound was the distant drip of moisture on stone, I thought I could hear whispers coming from the alcoves, voices speaking in languages that made my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges? He would think me mad, or worse, touched by corruption. And then I would be removed from my post, interrogated by the ecclesiarchy's investigators, possibly even subjected to neural probing to root out any taint that might have infected my soul. Better to keep silent, to attribute these experiences to isolation and exhaustion, to the natural result of spending too much time alone in the dark with only the dead for company. But the whispers grew louder. Or perhaps I simply grew more attuned to them, my senses adapting to the vault's particular frequencies. After years of immersion in its atmosphere, I began to recognize patterns in the sounds, rhythms that suggested communication rather than random noise. When I worked near the alcove containing the jawbone of St. Teresa the Unbroken, I would hear what sounded like singing, a melody that existed just below the threshold of conscious perception, felt more than heard. The skull of Brother Matthias, who had died defending a shrine from raiders 3 centuries prior, seemed to emanate a low humming that made my fillings vibrate and left a taste of copper in my mouth. And the vial of the Emperor's blood, that dubious relic in its fortified alcove, produced a sound like screaming, distant and distorted, as if transmitted through infinite layers of reality. I started spending longer hours in the vault, arriving before the mute servant brought the second key, waiting at the door in the pre-dawn darkness, my own key held tight in my fist until the metal grew warm from my body heat. The archdeacon noticed eventually, commenting during one of his rare visits to the vault, that I seemed particularly dedicated, that my devotion was admirable, that the Emperor surely smiled upon such zealous service. I smiled and nodded and said nothing about the real reason, about the compulsion that drew me down those worn stairs earlier each day, about the way my thoughts would circle endlessly around the relics when I was away from them, about the dreams that had progressed from vague sensations to vivid nightmares, where I walked through corridors of bone while voices called my name, in tones of accusation and hunger. The breakthrough, if it could be called that, came during my 6th year in the vault. I had been assigned the task of conducting the quinquennial inspection of the relics in the deepest section, an area known as the Sanctum of Forgotten Martyrs, where the most obscure and poorly documented artifacts were stored. This section was rarely visited, deemed less important than the major relics that drew pilgrims from across the sector, and as such, it had accumulated a thick layer of dust and neglect despite the preservation protocols. I descended into that lower level with my tools and my candles, my breath misting in air that seemed somehow colder than the vault proper, and began the tedious work of inspecting and cataloging hundreds of artifacts whose provenances were questionable at best. It was while examining a cracked reliquary containing what was labeled as a fragment of bone from an unknown martyred sister that I noticed the inscription on its base. The writing was in a script I didn't recognize, predating even the most archaic forms of High Gothic in the Ecclesiarchy archives. The letters seemed to shift in the candlelight, their shapes uncertain, and looking at them too long made my eyes water and my head throb with the beginning of a migraine. I traced the inscription with my finger, feeling the grooves worn into the metal. And as I did so, I felt a sudden clarity descend on me like a falling blade. A moment of perfect understanding that shattered everything I had believed about my work, about this place, about the nature of the relics I had tended for 6 years in faithful ignorance. The relics were not holy. They were not blessed. They were not conduits for the Emperor's grace or physical links to the martyred dead. They were something else entirely. Something that predated the Imperium and perhaps predated humanity itself. Something that had been collected and venerated and surrounded with ritual and prayer, not to preserve them, but to contain them, to keep them quiescent through constant attention and devotion, to prevent them from waking fully and doing whatever it was they wanted to do in the material universe. The prayers were not celebrations, but bindings. The oils were not preservatives, but suppressants. And the Relic Keepers were not guardians, but wardens, prison guards assigned to an eternal watch over inmates who could never be released because they could never truly die. I should have run then. I should have dropped that cracked reliquary and fled up those 364 stairs, should have burst through the cathedral doors into the sunlight and never looked back, should have boarded the first transport off-world and disappeared into the teeming masses of some distant hive city where no one would ever find me. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because in that moment of revelation, I also understood that it was already too late. That 6 years of exposure had changed me in ways both subtle and profound. That something had been seeping into me through all those hours of close contact with the relics. Through breathing air that they had saturated with their presence. Through handling them with my bare skin when the protocols required it. Through sleeping mere meters above them, night after night, while my unconscious mind lay vulnerable and open. I was no longer entirely human. The thing that looked like me, that moved with my gait and spoke with my voice, was a hybrid now. A creature that existed in the space between flesh and whatever the relics truly were. I could feel it when I looked inward, could sense the foreign presence coiled around my thoughts like a parasite around an intestine. Not separate from me, but not quite part of me either. It didn't control me, not directly, not yet. But it influenced me, shaped my perceptions, directed my attention towards certain relics and away from others, guided my hands as I performed the daily rituals without my conscious awareness of the manipulation. The dreams made sense now. They had never been dreams at all, but communications. The relics reaching out to me through the thin barrier of sleep, teaching me their language, preparing me for this moment of understanding. And the whispers were not hallucinations, but actual sounds, vibrations and frequencies that normal human ears couldn't detect, but which I had been gradually modified to perceive. The relics were alive in their way, and they had been slowly making me into something that could truly serve them, something that could understand their needs and desires, something that could perhaps eventually free them from their prison of prayer and protocol. I returned to my routine as if nothing had changed, because what else could I do? I performed the daily rituals, recited the litanies, cleaned and maintained the reliquaries with the same dedication I had always shown. But now I did so with full awareness of what I was really doing. And that awareness was a burden that grew heavier with each passing day. Father Dominic noticed a change during our next confession, commented that I seemed troubled, that perhaps the isolation was beginning to affect me, that maybe I should request a rotation to the surface for a few days of rest and sunlight. I thanked him for his concern and told him I was fine, that I had simply been working too hard, that a few extra hours of sleep would restore me. He seemed satisfied with this explanation, or at least willing to accept it. And he blessed me and departed up those worn stairs, his footsteps echoing in the silence like the heartbeat of the world above. The other Relic Keepers. There were 7 of us in total, each assigned to different sections of the vast vault system that sprawled beneath the shrine world, began to avoid me without quite knowing why. We would pass each other in the corridors sometimes, those rare occasions when our rounds overlapped, and I would see their eyes slide away from mine, see them quicken their pace as if eager to be away from my presence. They could sense it, I think, could feel on some instinctive level that I had become other, that something about me was wrong in a way that defied rational explanation. One of them, a young woman named Serena, who had taken her oaths only 2 years before, actually crossed herself when our paths crossed in the Hall of Lesser Martyrs, her lips moving in a prayer of protection as she hurried past me. I wanted to call out to her, to warn her, to tell her to run while she still could. But the words wouldn't come. My voice had become unreliable, occasionally producing sounds I didn't intend, syllables in that same shifting language I had seen inscribed on the reliquary's base. The Archdeacon summoned me to his chambers 9 years into my service, a meeting that had never occurred before and which filled me with a dread I couldn't quite articulate. His quarters were in the cathedral's eastern spire, a lavishly appointed suite of rooms that stood in stark contrast to the Spartan cells where the Relic Keepers lived. He sat behind a desk of dark wood, his ceremonial vestments gleaming with gold thread and precious stones. And he studied me with eyes that held a knowledge I hadn't expected, an awareness that suggested he understood far more about the relics than the official doctrine admitted. "You have been in the vault for 9 years, he said, his voice measured and careful. "That is longer than most manage before the work begins to affect them. Corvin lasted 12. His predecessor lasted only 7 before he had to be removed." Removed. The word hung between us like a blade. I understood what he meant without needing clarification, Relic Keepers who became too contaminated, too changed by their exposure, were quietly disappeared. Their names expunged from the records, their existence erased as if they had never been. The ossuary chapel with its rows of skulls was a lie, or at least only a partial truth. Only the keepers who died before the change progressed too far were given that honor. The others went somewhere else, somewhere deeper, to places the Archdeacon would never speak of openly. "I am honored to serve the Emperor in this capacity," I said, my voice steady, despite the fear that coiled in my chest. "I will continue until death or release. I will continue until he smiled, a thin expression that never reached his eyes. "Yes," he said, "you will continue. But understand that your service has been noted, that the ecclesiarchy is aware of your dedication, and understand too that there are limits to how long one can walk among the holy dead before becoming something other than human." I nodded because there was nothing else to do, no response that would change anything. I was too far gone to be saved and too useful to be disposed of immediately. So I would continue, day after day, year after year, tending relics that were not relics, serving a purpose that was never meant to be understood by those who performed it, becoming increasingly less myself and more something else, until the day when the transformation was complete and the thing wearing my face could no longer pass for human, even in the vault's forgiving darkness. That was 7 years ago. I am still here, still performing my duties, still descending those 364 stairs each morning with the mute boy who will not meet my eyes. The dreams have stopped because I no longer truly sleep, no longer sink into unconsciousness, but merely rest in a state of diminished awareness while my body repairs itself in ways that have nothing to do with normal human biology. I heal too quickly now when I cut myself on sharp edges or burn my fingers on hot wax. I no longer feel the cold, though I still feel heat, still feel pain, still feel the slow erosion of everything that once made me recognizable as a man who had a mother and a name and a future that extended beyond these stone walls. The whispers have become voices, clear and articulate, speaking to me in that alien language I now understand perfectly, though I could never translate it into any human tongue. The relics tell me things, share secrets about the universe that would drive ordinary minds into gibbering madness, but which I accept with the calm of someone who has already passed beyond the possibility of insanity. They tell me about the time before the Imperium, before humanity, before the stars were young. They tell me about gods that are not gods, about powers that slumber in the spaces between reality, about the thin membrane that separates existence from whatever lies beyond. And they tell me that I am not the first, that there have been others like me throughout history, caretakers and keepers and wardens who have been slowly transformed to serve purposes they could never fully comprehend. Sometimes new relic keepers are assigned to the vault, young men and women with faith in their eyes and devotion in their hearts. And I watch them begin the same journey I began 16 years ago. I want to warn them, want to tell them to flee before it is too late. But I know they would not believe me, even if I could form the words. They would think me mad or corrupted, would report me to the Archdeacon, and then I would be removed and replaced with someone else who would walk the same path toward the same inevitable destination. So I remain silent and watch them take their first steps into the darkness, knowing that in a few years they too will begin to hear the whispers, to feel the weight of something foreign taking root in their minds, to understand that they have not chosen this service, but have been chosen by it, selected by forces far older and far more powerful than the Imperium they believe they serve. The vault has grown larger. Or perhaps it has always been this large, and I simply could not perceive its true dimensions before. I walk for hours now, through corridors that do not appear in any map, through chambers filled with relics that have no documentation, no preservation protocols, no history except what they whisper to me in the darkness. Some of these artifacts are clearly not human in origin, crafted by hands that had different numbers of fingers, different concepts of aesthetics and function. Others might be human, but are so old that they predate any historical record. Relics from civilizations that rose and fell before humanity ever looked up at the stars and dreamed of conquest. I have met things in the deepest sections, creatures that were once relic keepers like myself, but who have been here so long that almost nothing human remains. They move through the shadows, their forms uncertain, their presence marked by the smell of ancient dust and the sound of breathing that follows rhythms too complex for human lungs. We do not speak these things, and I, but we acknowledge each other, a recognition that passes between us without words or gestures. They are my future, I understand, the end point of the transformation that has been progressing through my flesh and mind for 16 years. Someday I will join them in those lightless depths, will shed the last vestiges of the man I once was, will become fully what I have been slowly becoming since the day I first descended those 364 stairs with hope in my heart and faith in my soul. The Emperor does not exist in the vault. Or if he does, he is something very different from the God figure described in the catechisms and litanies. The relics do not respond to his name, do not acknowledge his divinity, do not care about humanity's endless war for survival. They are older than him, older than the species that built the Imperium, older perhaps than the galaxy itself. And they are patient, content to wait in their housings and reliquaries, surrounded by prayers that constrain without binding, tended by wardens who slowly transform into something that can never leave, never die, never stop serving the purposes they were never meant to understand. Father Dominic no longer visits. He died 2 years ago, his heart finally giving out on the long climb down those worn stairs. They replaced him with a younger priest, Father Alexis, who takes my confession with visible discomfort, who rushes through the rituals as if afraid that lingering too long will somehow contaminate him. He cannot look directly at me anymore, though I still look mostly human on the surface, still wear my robes and speak in approximations of human speech. Something about my presence disturbs him on a level deeper than conscious thought. Some instinct that recognizes predator or plague or something equally dangerous to his continued existence. He will not last long in this role, I think. Soon they will assign someone else, someone with stronger faith or duller senses, someone who can ignore the wrongness that emanates from me, like heat from a forge. I have stopped counting the days, stopped marking time in any conventional sense. The vault exists outside normal chronology, in a space where past and future fold into an eternal present, where the same rituals are performed over and over in an endless cycle that has no beginning and will have no end. I tend the relics as I have always tended them, as I will always tend them, as I have been tending them for far longer than 16 years, even though 16 years is all my human memories contain. Time is not linear here, not consistent, not reliable. Sometimes I find myself performing tasks I do not remember starting, standing in sections of the vault I have no memory of entering, holding relics I have never seen before. Though their weight is familiar in my hands, and their litanies flow from my lips as if I've recited them 10,000 times. The mute boy, who brings the second key each morning, has begun to show the signs. I see it in the way he lingers at the vault door, in the way his eyes linger on the darkness beyond, in the way he sometimes mouths words I cannot hear but can understand through the movement of his lips. He's being drawn in, selected, prepared. Soon he will take his oaths, will become a relic keeper, will descend into the darkness with faith in his heart and hope in his soul. And the cycle will continue, because the cycle always continues. Because the relics must be tended, and the wardens must be made, and the prison must be maintained, even though none of us truly understand what we are imprisoning or why. I no longer remember my mother's face. I no longer remember my name. The one I had before I took my oaths, the one that belonged to a person who existed in sunlight and breathed air that did not taste of stone and decay. I am only the keeper now, singular and eternal, a function rather than an individual, a role that has been filled by countless bodies over uncountable years. The man who descended those stairs 16 years ago is gone, dissolved like salt in water. And what remains is something that wears his shape and carries his memories, but is fundamentally other, fundamentally changed, fundamentally bound to this place and these relics, until the universe itself grows cold and dark and silent. But I am still aware. That is the worst part, the cruelest aspect of this transformation. I still possess consciousness, still experience the slow erosion of my humanity, still understand exactly what is happening to me and what I'm becoming. There is no mercy in this process, no dissolution into mindless servitude that might at least offer the comfort of oblivion. I will remain aware as I transform, as I lose myself piece by piece, as I descend deeper into the vault and take my place among the things that were once human. The wardens who can never leave, never die, never stop their eternal vigil over artifacts that should never have been collected, should never have been preserved, should have been destroyed or lost or forgotten, rather than gathered here in this prison beneath a world whose only purpose is worship of something that may not exist or may exist in forms we were never meant to comprehend. The candles still burn. The moisture still weeps down the walls. The relics still rest in their alcoves and niches, patient and eternal, whispering their secrets to anyone who will listen, anyone who stays long enough, anyone who becomes something other than human in the process of trying to serve. And I still tend them, day after day, year after year, because that is what I am now. That is all I am now. That is all I will ever be, in this life, and whatever comes after. The keeper, the warden, the thing that was once a man, who believed in the emperor and the righteousness of faith and the holiness of service to something greater than himself. I can see my reflection sometimes in the polished glass of the reliquaries, and each time there is less of me and more of something else, something with eyes that reflect light in colors that do not exist in the normal spectrum, something with skin that seems to shift and writhe when viewed from the corner of vision, something that is learning to exist partially in other dimensions, other states of being, because that is what is required to tend relics that exist partially in other dimensions, other states of being themselves. This is my purpose. This is my fate. This is what I chose when I took my oaths at 23 years old in a cathedral whose magnificence I can barely remember, surrounded by faithful whose faces have long since blurred into a collective mass of humanity that I am no longer part of. I will continue until there is nothing left to continue with, until the transformation is complete and I join the other wardens in the deepest sections of the vault. where even the whispers of the relics become screams that echo through dimensions we have no names for. And someday, perhaps, when the Imperium has fallen and the shrine world has been abandoned and the cathedral has crumbled into ruin, when there are no more priests to maintain the illusion and no more faithful to believe in the lie, when the seals finally fail and the bindings finally break, the relics will wake fully and remember what they were before they were imprisoned, before they were worshipped, before they were collected and contained and surrounded with prayers that were never quite strong enough to hold them forever. And we will still be here, the wardens, the keepers, the things that were once human, still performing our duties, still tending our charges, because that is what we have become. That is what we were always meant to become. That is the only truth in a universe built on lies. I am dead. I have been dead for 17 years, and I will be dead for eternity, though my heart still beats, and my hands still polish the glass, and my voice still recites the litanies in the darkness beneath the shrine world's surface. This is service. This is devotion. This is the horrifying life of a relic keeper in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, where there's only war and prayer and the slow dissolution of everything that makes us human, in the name of protecting humanity from truths it was never meant to know.